lucky to be able to be here, and we do little more than stand on the shoulders of those who have gone before us. And there are lots of players and participants in this audience who are as thoroughly familiar as are the speakers with the forces, factors, and phenomena that drive so much in terms of action and reaction and interaction, and also have ramifications and implications for America's interest, America's policies, and those of America's friends, allies, and strategic partners, as well as those of America's adversaries. So we have half a dozen speakers who'll come at these issues from their own perspectives. We've asked all of them to keep their remarks to under 10 minutes, with the exception of Colonel Roches, who's given 3.5 minutes. And at the end, we'll have our questions, and the best questions are those that do not start with W, vexing as they may be. Who needs to do this? What needs to be done? Why does it need to be done? Where will we be if we do this? Or where will we be if we don't do this? And sometimes even whether. But the most problematic ones are the how questions, because the answers to a how question cannot be yes or no. And they do have implications, oftentimes severe ones. There are no risk-free answers to the how questions. So those who are writing your questions on the 3x5 cards, please keep that in mind. Sometimes a W one is all right. And in terms of asking the speakers, what do you recommend that the U.S. In particular do or not do, given the realities that we face, and what would be the consequence if your recommendations are not taken into consideration. So I'll introduce the speakers in sequence there, and I first will be, I'll introduce them all together right now, and then they'll speak in the sequence from your right to left. Our first speaker will be a former Iraqi ambassador to the United Nations and to the United States, Samir Sumaida'ie. From 2004 to 2006, he was Iraq's ambassador to the permanent mission of Iraq to the United Nations. From 2006 to 2011, he was Iraq's ambassador to the United States. And before these positions, he was Iraq's Minister of Interior. Now, put yourself empathetically in the challenges that he had in terms of trying to rebuild the country's national police force after the United States representatives had done what they did to disband the military and effectively the cream of the crop of the police force. Next speaker is Dr. Imad Harb. As a major director of research and policy studies at the Abu Dhabi-based Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research. And we're lucky as can be that he's chosen to be with us. He is the National Council's first ever distinguished who is no stranger to this audience either. Tom had 3 years as the Director of Research at the Middle East Policy Council. We share the same floor and the same part of 6 years in Abu Dhabi, researching his landmark book dealing with the 3 UAE islands that were taken on December the 1st, 1971, Greater and Lesser Tanab and Abu Musa in Iran's international relations. Colonel David Roches is an alumnus of the National Council's Malone Faculty Fellows in Arab and Islamic Studies program in Syria. He's been a graduate of the University of London, studied under Professor Lawrence Friedman. He's a former director of Arabian Peninsula and Gulf Affairs for the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Strategic Studies at the Department of Defense. And then following is Matthew Reynolds. He's a Rice, and he is the head of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for North America, and with responsibility for some Palestinian citizens of Israel. And last but not least, we have Joshua Yaphe, that the acorn does not fall far from the tree. And so it's usually put in the context of father and son, and some and most productive of analysts and writers and speakers in terms of Iraq. These are our speakers.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anthony. I'll try to keep to 10 minutes. The situation in Iraq and the Middle East is so complex that really you cannot say much in 10 minutes. But I'll try to distill as much as I can into this short time. One thing I have learned over the years is that actions and policies which appear to be attractive at the time, if not thought through, can have devastating long-term consequences. We are living now through the long-term devastating consequences of policies and actions that took place decades ago. Now, I'll try to elaborate on this. Iraq, after the much maligned Sykes-Picot treatment and the establishment of the state of Iraq by the British, was doing reasonably well. I grew up during the monarchy when life in Baghdad was very pleasant. People were progressing, they had hope. Baghdad itself was peaceful, the country generally was peaceful, education was being built up, it was good. I was a product of a high school, public school in Baghdad, got a scholarship because I achieved good marks, was sent at the government expense to the UK to study, and found myself, in terms of my academic level, very comfortable with with the British students. What I'm trying to say is that the country was doing very well, and it had prospects. Institutions were being built. Infrastructure was being built. The oil revenue was being invested wisely. There was hardly any corruption. Then there was the military coup, which overthrew that order and started Iraq on the way downwards. That was a huge step backwards for Iraq, which we're still paying for until now. But that military coup produced the regime of the Baathists in 1963 and 1968 later, and then the absolute dictatorship of Saddam Hussein, who took Iraq into war after war and completely destroyed Iraq. The only institutions that were left standing at the end were the security institutions. The rest of Iraq was destroyed, and what Saddam and the wars did not destroy, the sanctions did. The sanctions actually did not hurt the regime, they hurt the Iraqi people, they destroyed even the social fabric in Iraq and made corruption established and deep-rooted. Now, enter the Americans. We don't want to go over the history of how and why and so on, but the Americans entered, I think, without much idea of what they were walking into. And they took some very bad decisions at the beginning. At the beginning, everybody assumed that the Americans have come. Okay, Saddam Hussein was removed. Practically everyone in Iraq was happy that Saddam was removed, and they were looking to see which way the Americans were going to go. They disbanded the military, That was a bad decision, now everybody agrees. But they also disbanded the police, not only the elite of the police, the police. Imagine in New York or Chicago or Washington, D.C., for prolonged periods without any police. I don't want to talk about Ferguson today, but I want to talk about what can happen in a society which is already traumatized, already brutalized, already living with violence, and simply having no law and order implements. That led to the looting and the chaos that took place, which you saw on your television screens, and then from then on, trying to erect a new political order that can take the country out of this situation into some orderly state. Now, our American new lords wanted to create us in their image, wanted to have a democracy with decentralized government and all the democratic institutions ticking like the clockwork. But they had this idea of Iraq as being a community split into Sunnis, Shi'is, Kurds, and these communities had to be represented separately. As a result, they instituted a political system which deepened these divisions, which made even people like me who are largely unaware or unconscious or not, who couldn't care about their individual sectarian affiliation, to be much more conscious of it, and therefore to act in accordance with that consciousness. At the same time, we had sectarian Islamist parties, mostly trained and funded outside the country, who entered this political process, and it was in their interest to play politics in this way. So that's a collusion of policies that resulted from vested interests on the one hand by Islamists, local Islamists, and an American perception which in my opinion was misguided. As a result, we had the successive governments that took place with the idea that winner takes all. If the Shia are the majority, well, they're going to make sure that they get all the benefits, and that's it. And the others can go and walk off into the distance. This, of course, didn't work and created the conditions that led to the current situation. Iraq is not in a vacuum. Iraq lives in a neighborhood which is on fire. Historically, in the longer scale, we have a whole region which is just beginning to wake up out of the Middle Ages. The culture, the mentality, even the religion is not reformed. And to be sprung into the 21st century and be forced to compete on the world stage, it is not equipped. So they need to have this transition, they need to have this change in order so that they can catch up. And again, when we witnessed the Arab Spring, we found that it faltered. It faltered because of a whole number of reasons, some internal and some external. All of this has impacted, or from one thing happening in one country impacted what's happening in another. What happened in Egypt, for example, had profound impact on what happened in Syria, and so on. Syria has impacted Iraq considerably. And I don't want to go into the missteps that took place in the Syrian situation. As a result, now we have a monster in the form of the Islamic State, which is wreaking havoc in Iraq, and nobody seems to know what to do with it. I'm sure some of my distinguished colleagues and speakers will be tackling those necessary policies in terms of what to do with the current situation. But I really wanted to put to paint a picture of the context in which this current catastrophe is taking place, and to project forward. Unless we deal with the fundamental issues, we cannot get out of this situation. We have three levels. One is the humanitarian level. We have families who are evicted from their homes, who are threatened, who have no water, no food. They have to be dealt with. Refugees have to be dealt with urgently, today, this week, not in 3 months' time. Then we have to get a political order that is sustainable and can combat terrorism and can reconstitute the country in any stable form. It doesn't have to be exactly it cannot be exactly how it was before the 1950s. That is impossible. That's gone. The situation has changed. But we've got to constitute it in a way that is sustainable. Lastly, we have to, in the long term, create an alliance, not only a regional, local alliance, but international alliance to combat the ideology of terrorism. Much of the terrorism that is active in the region is anchored, is based on a religious interpretation of Islam that's not acceptable. It's very closely linked specifically to the Wahhabi sect, which is actively promoted and funded and is creating problems and if you like, producing on a mass scale many monsters who grow up into full-fledged, bloodthirsty terrorists. So these three levels, the humanitarian short term, the political middle term, and the ideological long term, have to be welded together to create a strategy, an overarching strategy that should be embraced by the United States, by its allies, by the local populations, and all these forces have to come together to create a long-term solution. I must also mention that there are other festering issues that aggravate the situation, such as the Palestinian-Israeli issue. Now, without a resolution of that problem, there's going to be always a recruiting possibility for terrorists, and there's going to be a continued source of instability. So I don't know whether I've taken more than my share of time, but thank you very much. I'll stop there and leave the rest to the questions and answers. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I basically was given the opportunity to speak a little bit about Syria and Lebanon as they influence the what we might call very in a very minimal kind of way disaster situation in the Middle East, unfortunately. There is an arc of instability extending all the way from Iraq to Lebanon, another one extending from Yemen to Libya, and hopefully these things will be somehow as peacefully as possible dealt with soon. But in Lebanon, the situation is not quite that good, unfortunately. two very important developments are basically putting the country's future and development on the line. One of them is basically the issue of the institutional discontinuity that is threatening the future of the country. First of all, there is no president. There have not been a president elected since the end of the tenure of the former president, Michel Suleiman May. And the present House of Deputies, Chamber of Deputies, the Parliament, is the term of which is about to expire in November of this year. And so these two institutional discontinuities are really very, very serious. No president and possibly no parliament means two institutions of the Lebanese Republic are not working, so there will only be a council of ministers that would be basically working just in a capacity of a caretaker government, so to speak, because there is no, Parliament cannot legislate if it's not there. The president can't sign decrees if he is not there. So we have a very, very big institutional problem. As far as the U.S. is concerned, as far as the president, the election for a president, I think the U.S. has and will probably continue to be working on electing some sort of a consensus candidate. Obviously, there is General Aoun, who is the leader of the largest Christian bloc within Parliament, who himself is a candidate for the position, but he is very much out of the question. Nobody is going to accept him. Another candidate is the leader of the Lebanese Forces Party, which is a former warlord, Samir. He's also not very acceptable to a whole bunch of other people. So obviously there has to be some sort of a consensus candidate who falls within these two extremes. Obviously, somebody who is truly centrist, who is accepted by both camps in the country. Only problem is the issue of the presidency and the issue of the different political factions is not only a domestic issue, it's also a regional issue. There is a lot of regional influence in the country, and the country is not basically speaking for itself only. There are other people who are speaking for it and have their own influences within its institutions and its political parties. As far as the parliament is concerned, today, as a matter of fact, the electoral committees were supposed to have been called into action to prepare for the elections that would be supposedly taking place in November of this year, 3 months hence. The present parliament anyway is in an extended session at any rate. They extended it back in June of 2013 for 17 months. So they can really deal with certain issues and develop. At the time they didn't have a government, so they also had a problem with forming the government. So the issue is very, very much political in this situation here. The Maronites want the presidency to be established. In other words, no Maronite is really going to let the parliament. I should put it this way: a Maronite president sits across the table from a Shiite Speaker of Parliament. In other words, if you don't give us our president, we're not going to give you a parliament. In other words, no extension for the parliament, for the current parliament. In other words, there is no institution, either institution in the executive branch or the legislative branch. So this is why the situation is rather dire. So there has to be work towards that end. The other problem, other than the institutional discontinuity, is the issue of the jihadists in the country. Unfortunately, Lebanon, that has never been a place for jihadists, is becoming not necessarily a place for jihadists, but people are listening in the cities, in the poor areas of the cities, to jihadi talk. And obviously, specifically, outside of the Shiite camp, which is basically controlled by Hezbollah and the Amal movement. The Sunni cities are also beginning to have some sort of a burgeoning, so if you will, of certain jihadi tendencies, jihadi thought, and they're recruiting certain people, being helped in that matter by funding from different entities within and outside of the country, and being also helped by the presence of and the reality of the presence of Palestinian refugee camps in the country where Palestinian jihadists are also working. So these issues are really quite important, and basically at the beginning of the month, this issue of the jihadists basically showed up on the eastern shore of the country, and in the town of Arsal, and they took it over. They took the town and the police contingent hostage until the army interfered, obviously, and liberated the town. But now they have hostages also. They ran away, but they also took Lebanese police and soldiers hostage with them to Syrian camps. In this issue, obviously, the United States is called upon to help the Lebanese army, obviously. There have always been problems with helping the Lebanese army. The United States has always held back on helping, specifically because it didn't know where Hezbollah is going with the country. Well, they didn't know then, but now they know that Hezbollah is almost controlling the country, and if they didn't help the army then, they should help it now, at least because there are jihadists trying to infiltrate the place, infiltrate the country. So the United States is called upon to help in this manner. The United States is also called upon to help in trying to re-implement United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701 that ended the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah. That 1701 basically stipulated that UNIFIL, which is United Nations Interim Forces in Lebanon, United Nations forces would be spread all over the perimeters of Lebanon, basically on the borders, to basically monitor the security situation. Maybe it's time, and that resolution was only implemented in the south, and UNIFIL forces are acting in the south. There is probably about anywhere between 12 and 13,000 soldiers there. But 1701 should extend to other places, and the United Nations, the United States can help with that. The only problem with it is where will additional troops come from? And this is the biggest, probably the biggest issue. Another big issue is the issue of whether Hezbollah and the Syrian government would accept deploying United Nations troops along the borders between Lebanon and Syria. I mean, Lebanon is experiencing the repercussions of that war. Finally, they have arrived, and Syria was never going to be only Syria. The Syrian war was not only going to be a Syrian war, it was sooner or later going to be everybody else's war, and Lebanon has basically now actively begun into it, came into it, but at the same time, Hezbollah has been in Syria for about 2 years now and has been fighting there, and that was a big, that is becoming a very, very big political hot issue in Lebanon. As far as Syria is concerned, unfortunately, 3.5 years of war, probably close to about 200,000 killed, 8 million IDPs and refugees outside of the country. The place has become an attractive point for jihadists everywhere. Unfortunately, the moderate opposition is not quite strong. It's not quite active. It really does not control a whole lot of the country. The country is being controlled. The cities are controlled by the regime. The countryside is controlled by mostly jihadists between the Islamic State, formerly Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and the Jabhat al-Nusra. The problem with the Syrian situation is not only that it is an active war, civil war, in which tens of people die every day and hundreds more are wounded or made homeless. The problem is also that it is it's creating new conditions for yet more sectarian problems in the area, and the issue within Syria itself. There are certain communities now that have not claimed to have participated in the war and don't claim to be against or with the regime, and now they're being forced to make a decision, to make a stand. Will you be with us or will you not be with us? And specifically, I'm talking about the southeast of the country, the Druze community down there that is being forced by Jabhat al-Nusra forces to either declare that you are Muslims and against the regime, or something else will be done with you. So it's not only that ISIS is doing the same thing in Iraq, but also Jabhat al-Nusra is doing it in Syria. As for the U.S., the U.S. has always called and continues to call for the departure of Bashar al-Assad. I really don't know how that is going to happen so long as Iran and Hezbollah and Russia are behind Bashar al-Assad. This is a very, very tall order to accomplish. Obviously, the Geneva process that was begun in the summer of last year was, well, actually, no, the summer of the year before, I think, was not really followed by a Geneva 2. It was only a Geneva 1, and the Geneva 2 basically collapsed. The Geneva 1 had negotiated some sort of a deal where he might leave peacefully, but apparently he dug his heels in and he is not leaving. The United States will probably, I really don't know what the United States can do. So far, I think that at least 2 years of time have been lost, and I don't know what the United States can do anymore. There just might be a situation where the W word comes, this is the word you don't want to hear, that if the United States airplanes are bombing ISIS in northern Iraq, maybe if they veer a little bit to the left and bomb ISIS somewhere in Raqqa or somewhere in Syria, maybe they change the situation there. I really don't know how much they can do. But I'd leave the rest of whatever is going on in Lebanon and Syria to a question and answer period. I look forward to them. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to change the order of my remarks a little because two of the co-panelists have covered some of the material. And so I think I'll go straight to Iran and refer you back to the speech that President Obama made to the West Point in May, where he spoke about this as if it were and is a question of upholding the international order and upholding international law and international institutions, and something that requires multilateral action to deal with, although he said we would leave the option of force on the table. He did not speak about the geopolitical challenge that Iran presents to its neighbors, and didn't speak about Iran's neighbors much at all in that context. But because he reached out to Iran and because Iran has a new president, we therefore have a process of diplomacy, and there was a joint plan of action reached with Iran on its nuclear program in November. And although they did not reach a conclusion by the July deadline, they did think enough progress was made to continue and to give it a 4-month extension. Just to give you an idea of what has been agreed upon, Iran has limited its enrichment of uranium hexafluoride to under 5%, uranium-235, which is sufficient to fuel a reactor, but not sufficient to produce a weapon. It had been enriching to the level of 20%, and it has diluted all of that or converted all of that to fuel rods for its reactors. And it has agreed to design changes at a light water reactor that might have been able to produce plutonium as a second route to a weapon, although they never built a reprocessing facility for the light water reactor, and that would be necessary. And they're in discussions about different uses for the facilities at Fordo, which were discovered 2 or 3 years ago. And they've limited themselves to the 10,000 functioning centrifuges that are already functioning and are not turning on the 8,000 or 9,000 other centrifuges that they have already in their inventory. And we have agreed to some limits on the sanctions, although they're very modest limits. We're allowing them to export, I believe, 1 million barrels of oil per day and earn the revenue from that and release some funds for them, but we haven't lifted the major sanctions on their oil industry and certainly not on their central bank. So this may be the best way to get an agreement on Iran's nuclear program. And even the Gulf Arab government individuals that I've spoken to hope so. But those Gulf Arabs are a little concerned about the fact that we started these negotiations through Oman in secret and did not include them. And they do think they ought to be included so that the permanent 5 members of the Security Council plus 1, namely Germany, really ought to include some of those GCC states. If there is an agreement, I think there's quite a large gap between the parties. We are talking about permitting the operation of maybe 4,000 centrifuges, the first generation centrifuges, and they are talking about 20,000. We're talking about they're talking about a period of time that might last 3 or 7 years, and then they would be permitted to do whatever they wish. We're talking about a period of time more like 20 years. So I think there's quite a large gap, and I'm not sure they'll reach an agreement at the end of this 4-month period of time. And there are other questions that have to be resolved too, because the International Atomic Energy Agency still has unresolved questions about possible previous military research. And so Iran is being asked to answer questions about evidence that it may have engaged in testing explosives and detonators and doing designs, warhead designs, and the like. And so far they're really not satisfying the IAEA, although its head said 2 or 3 days ago he expected some results soon. I would say that although the Gulf Arabs would like to see some successful outcome here, they're pretty concerned about it, and they think that we're far enough away to be more comfortable and more flexible than they would like to be. They consider themselves to be on the front line, and I think if an agreement is reached whereby Iran is permitted to continue enriching uranium to any level at all, then you would probably find Saudi Arabia and some others embark on that themselves. When the UAE signed agreements to build nuclear power in the UAE, they agreed to not enrich. And as a matter of fact, if you read the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, of which Iran is a signatory, and which does permit Iran and others to have a civilian nuclear program, it doesn't explicitly say that enrichment is an inviolable element of a civilian nuclear program. Iran doesn't want to rely upon foreign sources of enriched uranium, but Israel and the Gulf Arabs would like to see zero enrichment, and if that's not the agreement, I think you'll see them take some kind of compensating action. But more than that, they are concerned that the United States is interested enough in this agreement that it may acquiesce in Iran's ambitions through the region, and particularly in the Arab world. So they view some of the challenges that they deal with in the region as the result of American policies, as the ambassador was saying not long ago. They warned us not to invade Iraq in 2003. They told us we wouldn't be able to handle the unforeseen consequences of that. They are very, very uneasy that we haven't intervened in a more robust way in Syria. Of course, they're disappointed deeply in our failures, our repeated failures to bring about an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement. So they're concerned that we will somehow, for the sake of a nuclear agreement, acquiesce in the expansion of Iranian influence in the region. And you see Iranian influence, of course, in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, and to a certain extent, although I think it's exaggerated, in the Palestinian region. Now, let me go to the question of Iranian influence in the region in just a few minutes. As I said, Obama did talk about this Iranian nuclear challenge in his speech at West Point, but he didn't identify it as the major threat facing the United States or the region. He identified loosely connected networks of terrorists with local agendas as the number one threat to the United States, and announced a new counterterrorism policy that would help train security partners so that we have cooperative multilateral efforts in dealing with this challenge. And not long after that, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant swept down the Tigris River Valley and took Mosul, and the Iraqi army retreated, which brought into question the strategy, the tactic of relying upon local security partners to deal with this threat. It even brings into question whether or not we can rely on the Afghan security partners we've trained after we leave Afghanistan. Obama said that Syria would be a major focus of his new counterterrorism policy, and I don't want to repeat everything that Imad said, but basically, although the U.S. has supported some collective action, some diplomacy, some sanctions, some training of some partners, and it really hasn't done what some of the Gulf Arab neighbors and Jordan and even Lebanese Christians would have liked to see us do, which would be no-fly zones, safe zones, humanitarian corridors, maybe targeted airstrikes, particularly after Syria's use of chemical weapons in the suburbs of Damascus last year. And secondly, because the regime is an Alawite regime, an offshoot of Shiism, and because it's supported by Iran, has been supported by Iran for a long time, and because the opposition is largely Sunni, and the casualties being taken by the Sunni rebels, by the Syrian rebels are largely Sunni. That arouses the concern of Gulf Arab states and enhances their criticism of American policy. And we've struggled with how to deal with this and who we might give arms to, who could be vetted sufficiently with the help of, let's say, Saudi intelligence services to receive our weapons, and without keeping us awake at night about who might get their hands on those weapons later on, but we haven't resolved that. We haven't resolved that. In fact, American weapons were captured by the Islamic State when Iraqi military retreated. Am I running out of time? Okay. So that gives us the question of Iraq, and I'll just say one or two words here. Terrible problem. We are doing something about it with the airstrikes, but clearly we can't do it alone. Iran has had a lot of influence with the Iraqi government. The Iraqi government hasn't reached out sufficiently to the rest of the population to give it a stake. And so Islamic State has found supporters on the ground in the Sunni community, and something has to be done about that. A more inclusive Iraqi government and help from Sunni Arab neighbors to drain Sunni Arab support away from the Islamic State. There seems to be a temporary convergence of interest with Iran on that, but I think we have to remember who our longtime friends and partners have been, and they're concerned about overt cooperation with Iran, which probably doesn't wish them well in the long run, and might even want to see the Islamic State challenge Saudi Arabia along its borders or inside Saudi Arabia. And I'll take questions on that, as everybody will, since I've run out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anthony, for the opportunity to participate in an important study with such august policy experts. And apropos of nothing, since it is the month of August, and these guys are August, I should note that yesterday was the 2000th anniversary of the death of Augustus Caesar. That's trivia for you. Let me start by saying my remarks do not reflect the views of the National Defense University, the Department of Defense of the United States government. My remarks today will focus on the military aspects of the situation in Iraq and the U.S. response, so I want to thank Dr. Mattair for teeing that up for me. I will start by looking at the nature of the IS threat, ISIS, Daesh, whatever you want to call it, then the dilemma facing the United States, then the response taken by the United States, and I'll discuss possible endgames for the situation, and I'll answer any questions with the rest of the group. First, the nature of the IS threat. Much has been written about the speed with which ISIS advanced through the Sunni regions of Iraq. I would like to make 2 points here. The first is that IS should not be made out to be more than it is. It is not Napoleon sweeping through Central and Eastern Europe. What IS has succeeded in doing is ousting a corrupt and ineffective Shia-dominated security and defense force from a region mostly inhabited by Sunnis who were opposed to the Maliki regime in general and corrupt Shia-dominated security forces in particular. The IS advance is not notable so much for the speed in which the movement spread, but rather the speed with which the Shi'i-led and manned security forces collapsed. The historical metaphor here is the collapse of Great Britain's forces in Burma and the armed forces of the Netherlands and Indonesia in 1942. The Japanese military that they faced were definitely adept in battle, but a key and often unrecognized factor was the role played by an almost entirely hostile native Asian population in both Indonesia and Burma. The second advantage enjoyed by IS in its role as a defiantly muscular opposition to a governmental structure and system of political dynamics that have passed their shelf expiration date. The IS has stood up to al-Assad and al-Maliki and has prospered doing so. IS has donned the robes and masks of the champion of the oppressed in the face of a world order that is increasingly war-weary and preoccupied with other issues and challenges. To a certain set of people in both the East and the West, IS is quite simply sexy. Now the challenge faced by the United States. The problem in Iraq is very much a consequence of how the U.S. chose to de-escalate the violence in the Sunni portions of Iraq during the famed Sunni awakening. It was foreseeable, and it was argued at the time, that paying non-governmental Sunni militias to, in effect, not oppose the Iraqi government would inevitably produce a situation that would work against the interests of peace in Iraq. Sooner or later, the Sunnis would either have to integrate themselves into the poorly paid, poorly led, Shia-dominated Iraqi security institutions, or they would choose to stand apart, and it seems as though the Sunnis have chosen the latter option, to stand apart. The United States faces an acute dilemma here. On the one hand, the United States cannot be so active in supporting the Iraqi government that it stifles the impetus for reform in Iraq. If the Baghdad regime, regardless of who leads it, perceives it has unconditional or the near unconditional support of the U.S., then why would it reform? On the other hand, if the U.S. fails to support the Iraqi regime in a meaningful way, Iran will embed itself even deeper into the Iraqi government, while at the same time the Kurds will cement their increasingly de facto independence and bulk up their control over the oil center of Kirkuk. And it hasn't been remarked upon enough that the Kurds are focused on fighting the war, but they're also focused on winning the peace. And when ISIS took Mosul, the Kurds took Kirkuk. Not quite as nastily, but they took it, and they have it. Trapped on the horns of this dilemma, the U.S. decision to support Kurdish forces, primarily Kurdish forces, with airstrikes seems to be efficacious. It enables U.S. air power to work at blunting the IS advance, while at the same time depriving the Iraqi regime's elites of an American imprimatur on their way of doing business for the past few years. At the same time, the U.S. is providing some limited military assistance, mostly small arms and ammunition, to Kurdish military forces. Again, the U.S. needs to finally balance competing goals, and unfortunately, the United States has not proven itself particularly adept at finally balancing goals and issues of security, particularly in this country. Not only are the Kurds at odds with the Iraqi government, but they're also at odds with each other. In the not-too-distant past, the Barzani and Talabani factions of the Iraqi Kurdish movement were at war with each other. Alliances of convenience were struck between one Kurdish group and Saddam Hussein against another Kurdish group just within the last 20 years or so. Add to the mix the potent Turkish and Syrian Kurdish forces, who also have their own separate aims, and you get a situation where the United States can't really provide heavy weaponry to the Kurds without upsetting a rather tenuous balancing act. The PDK, PUK, PKK, and YPG, those are the Kurdish movements of various flavors, form a volatile alphabet soup, which is the best force to win the war against the IS, at least in those regions where they occupy. Unfortunately, the various Kurdish groups are concerned with winning the peace as well as with winning the war, and can be expected to divert military assets to the big prize of Kirkuk even while combat rages. So we can't really write a blank check for the Kurds because we don't know where it's going to go. So what is the U.S. military doing, or what is the U.S. doing militarily? Press reports indicate that carrier-based aviation and more recently land-based bombers are flying from the northern Gulf to Iraq, dropping bombs and then returning. And I haven't seen it in the press where the land-based bombers are going from, but my guess is it's not a short distance, it's a rather long distance. The Navy is happy in this time of contracting defense budgets to prove the continued relevancy of carrier aviation, but this way of doing business is subject to the law of diminishing returns. That's Mr. O'Malley telling me to shut up. I haven't had a call on that phone in 5 days. While it's politically expedient, While politically expedient, since it avoids having boots on the ground, it subjects aircraft to extreme risk and is reliant upon munitions such as 500-pound bombs, which may not be effective against a rapidly dispersing threat such as IS armed vehicles. IS is no longer laying mortar batteries and artillery batteries out in the open as if they were operating on a pool table. They are now hiding targets or hugging civilian targets to minimize the threat from bombing, particularly from high-altitude bombing. Robert Scales's editorial in last Thursday's Washington Post, which draws on his book Firepower in Limited War, which is a great book, is the best discussion of this issue. The best way to neutralize the IS threat, which is mostly armored vehicles, mortars, and artillery pieces, would be with a ground-based A-10 capability. The A-10 has a long loiter time. It's very resilient against ground fire, which is the primary threat that IS will have. It can fly slowly enough to identify targets and minimize the risk of civilian damage. Unfortunately, this optimal military solution, the A-10, runs against two political imperatives. The first is the Obama administration seems to be adamant against having large numbers of forces on the ground, and the A-10 can't operate from such long distances. The second is that the U.S. Air Force is entering the end game of a generational struggle to eliminate its only dedicated ground support aircraft and won't allow a tactical emergency to take the noose from around the A-10's neck. They want to get rid of the A-10. They've wanted to for the start, and we won't see it. So the United States finds itself in the somewhat odd military position of supporting an ineffective and largely illegitimate Iraqi government against an enemy that should not be completely defeated, because the impetus for Iraqi government reform will recede from Baghdad at the same time IS recedes from the battlefield. The U.S. military effort is tailored to avoid defeat, not to secure victory. The real victory will occur when or if the Iraqi government becomes what we thought it would be in those hopeful days of 2007, and I hope that that vision is achieved, inshallah. I'll take any questions.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Anthony, and thank you to the Council. UNRWA has a working relationship and a nice partnership with the Council, so it's very nice to be here today. While others have been speaking more regionally, I've been asked to focus directly on the current crisis today that's happening in Gaza. And while a number of regimes and movements and crises have come and gone in the Middle East, in the course of modern Middle East history, one constant, persistent, and complicating factor that has remained consistently unresolved since the end of World War II is the question of Palestine and the fate of the Palestine refugee. At times it is directly at the heart of the crisis. We are witnessing that today in Gaza. At other times it's a lesser of an issue, a lesser of a factor, but it's always there, and it will remain an influencing element until a genuine and lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians can be negotiated and implemented, a peace which brings about a just solution to the plight of the Palestine refugee. You know, today there are some 5 million registered Palestine refugees in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. It is the mandate of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East. That's a really long title, so we use the acronym UNRWA, or in Arabic it would be UNRWA, to provide humanitarian and human development services to them. And though we depend on voluntary government contributions, and I publicly want to thank the U.S. government for its very consistent and generous support, the United States is our #1 supporter. Our programs are quasi-governmental in nature, providing a range of services including health, education, social support that not only sustain today but build productive lives into the future. We do not have a political mandate. The quartet handles that for the UN. The situation facing these refugees remains extremely precarious everywhere. And while I will focus today on Gaza, I remind that the Palestine refugees in Syria, in the besieged neighborhoods of Yarmouk and elsewhere, remain in horrific danger and despair. I welcome the opportunity to discuss that situation or other concerns about Lebanon and the West Bank, which of course is connected to Gaza, later if anyone has that interest. I know many of you have followed the violence in Gaza over the past month very intensely, and unlike in the past, there has been a lot of TV coverage, so I won't take a lot of time going over all the statistics, but they are mind-blowing, and they reveal that this time recovery will be exponentially more challenging. The devastation is much greater than people see on TV. Entire neighborhoods have been wiped out, and the overall stakes for the future are higher than ever. First, it's important to appreciate how small and densely populated Gaza is. If you superimpose Gaza over Washington, D.C., it would extend from the mixing bowl, where I-395 meets Springfield, just up above where the I-95 junction is just south of Laurel. At its widest, it would superimpose Arlington. But Gaza is really just mostly 3 miles wide. That's the distance from Georgetown to Capitol Hill. Now take away about 1/3 of that area, because that's an Israeli-imposed no man's land security zone. Now cram 1.7 million people into that small remaining area, 70% of whom are refugees served by UNRWA. Wall it in, fence it in, and allow for only the most minimal imports and essentially no exports, and don't allow the population to travel. They can't leave. Recall that 90% of the water is undrinkable and almost unusable due to salinity. Appreciate that electric power works, if you're lucky, 8 to 12 hours a day, and that was pre-conflict. Now most don't have any at all. And that over 40% of the population is unemployed, up to 65% if you're a youth and 80% if you're a younger woman, and endure these conditions for 7 years. Gaza is a unique case study of de-development. In 2000, UNRWA provided essential food assistance to just 80,000 people, like any government with a social safety net. At the beginning of this year, the figure was 830,000. By 2020, experts have judged Gaza unsustainable. Now, some describe Gaza as the world's largest ghetto, or worse, an open-air prison, and that was before this most devastating war. The past weeks have witnessed the largest displacement in the Gaza Strip since the 1967 war, with 1/3 of the total population, that's just a little under the entire population of Washington, D.C., displaced. At the peak of the fighting, UNRWA housed over 280,000 people in 90 schools. That's about 3,300 people in elementary and middle schools designed for 400 kids. 6 of these shelters were bombed, 3 with fatalities. Today, we continue to shelter 260,000 IDPs in 82 facilities, and the number is rising again due to the renewed hostilities. We have reached our tipping point, and we are now have to contend with new dangers, health and hygiene crises. So far, there have been about 2,000 Palestinians, mostly civilian deaths, and 66 Israelis, mostly soldiers, and 1 Thai guest worker killed in the Gaza war. 11 of my own UNRWA colleagues have been killed in Gaza. These are UN humanitarian workers. They're not militants. Early assessment suggests that at least 17,000 homes were destroyed or damaged. Things have had to stop because the ceasefire has stopped, rendering 100,000 people homeless. We expect some 65 to 70,000 Palestinians to stay in our school shelters as they have no homes to return to. UNRWA alone has over 100 facilities damaged. Yet through Herculean efforts, we have kept 14 of 21 health clinics open, serving over 20,000 patients. Repairing the damage and restarting the lives in Gaza will cost billions of dollars. Many of Gaza's factories and farms have been totally destroyed in what appears to be a case of revenge and retribution. For example, 1/2 of the supply of all poultry, 64,000 fowl, were eliminated. I'm not so sure what threat those hens posed, but they're gone. The only power plant was severely damaged and will be inoperative for months. Wastewater treatment facilities were destroyed, and this is kind of where I really scratch my head and ask, really? Because it appears that no one thought that the short-term impact of sticking it to Gaza this way means that raw sewage will now be dumping directly into the Mediterranean Sea, and Mother Nature doesn't care about man-made borders. So it'll eventually be washing ashore on the beaches of Ashkelon, Tel Aviv, and down to El Arish. And that's just the physical damage. The troubling psychosocial impact on both sides will linger for generations. The point here is that while some claim the status quo is sustainable, in reality it is not. This is the 3rd time in 6 years that there will have been a conflict in and around Gaza. While it goes without saying that the human suffering on both sides is immense, and that alone is enough reason to chart a different course, but this pattern of increasingly spiraling violence from both sides and the long-term negative effect it will have on the region at large is even more of a reason to seriously address and peacefully resolve the underlying Palestine question. We need to start, again, with rethinking, and we can start by rethinking the Gaza paradigm. There is no actor who can resolve this alone if we go back to the pre-existing conditions under occupation and blockade. If there is not something that brings a new paradigm, a new deal, a new hope for the people in terms of opening up, then Gaza and the interests of Israel and others, including the United States, will be consigned to incredible new difficulties in the future. To start, Gaza needs nothing less than a new deal, recovery and reconstruction, and an end to the current policy of collective punishment. Gaza must have its freedom of access, freedom of movement, freedom to import and export, freedom from aid dependency. The lesson of this past month is that millions of civilians deserve better. And as I said, we need to rethink the Gaza paradigm, or it will come back to haunt us all with a vengeance. Now, Israel has very serious and legitimate security concerns when it comes to Gaza. The UN has repeatedly condemned the rocket and other terrorist attacks against Israel and recognizes Israel's right to self-defense. But with today's proven monitoring regimes and modern technology, there is no legitimate security excuse to continue a Crusader-era type siege and collective punishment mentality against the civilians of Gaza. Given the disproportionate extent of damage to all sectors of life in Gaza, the ban on importing construction materials is socially untenable. People need to be able to rebuild their shattered homes. Easing the blockade would be an important first start and a message of hope for returning to the road to peace. Now, perhaps I'm an internal optimist. You kind of have to be one working where we do. But this latest round may offer a renewed chance maybe to kickstart the frozen peace process from many different angles. Perhaps some will appreciate that the Palestinian Authority is a partner for negotiation and will work with rather than against the current PA cabinet. Perhaps others will finally recognize that the violence they sow and perpetuate only brings greater anguish and suffering to their own people. Perhaps all will pause and think about the world they want their children to live in 20 years from now instead of the political gain they might achieve 20 days from now. But I think first and foremost, and when I had originally put this together, we had a ceasefire and we were looking at what reconstruction, how we were going to move forward, and the great measures that this would do. Unfortunately, now the concentration needs to be back again, first and foremost, thinking about the poor people caught in the middle, and at a minimum, return to a ceasefire, and start all over again. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this panel. I'm a big fan of everything the National Council does. I find they're one of the greatest advocates for promoting improved U.S.-Arab relations, one of the best tools that we have in this town. And the work they do is very valuable in so many ways. I wouldn't even have time to begin to express it, so I'm very glad to be here. I've been asked to speak today on the topic of how Saudi Arabia and the Arab Gulf states are responding to the current set of regional crises. Over the last few weeks, we've seen a clear recognition from the Saudi government of the threats and challenges it faces. Extremists with expansionist territorial ambitions are parked not far off Saudi Arabia's doorsteps. Riyadh has increased troop deployments to fill in the gaps along what is otherwise a very long and difficult border to patrol in the north. At the end of July, Crown Prince Salman visited the northern border region and met with troops there as a public sign of support for the armed forces. Saudi Arabia has explicitly designated ISIS a terrorist organization and criminalized private donations to it. All of this comes at a time when Riyadh and its Gulf neighbors are trying to formulate a response to the ongoing violence in Gaza. At the recent emergency meeting of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC in Jeddah, Saud al-Faisal, Saudi's foreign minister, decried the bloodshed there and announced $500 million in reconstruction funds for Gaza through the Saudi Fund for Development. King Abdullah called Israel's actions a crime against humanity and announced the Saudi government's donation of 200 million riyals to the Palestinian Red Crescent. In the UAE, Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid has spearheaded a drive to provide humanitarian assistance through the UN Relief and Works Agency, particularly with meals, medical supplies, and clean drinking water. 14 plane loads departed Dubai's humanitarian city in late July, and the Emirates Red Crescent has approved 13 million dirhams worth of medical supplies. The Arab Gulf states have a key role to play in mobilizing the international community's response to these crises. We see them today, as we have in other events the last 3 years since the beginning of the uprisings, pursuing a greater role in international diplomacy through multilateral forums, including the GCC, the Arab League, the OIC, and seeking throughout all of these processes to achieve greater action at the United Nations and from the West in general. Just last week, with the emergency meeting of the OIC, the statement that they released explicitly called for Chapter 7 of the UN to be applied to Israel. So, this type of diplomatic effort in the last 3 years has been characterized by close consultations within the GCC, very closed consultations, before taking action in these multilateral forums. And immediately prior to the OIC meeting last week, we saw Emirati Foreign Minister Abdullah bin Zayed meet with Saud al-Faisal in Jeddah for discussions. I'd like to draw some conclusions from these things, but let me do that in a minute. Let's try and clear a way through some of this history first. We see several examples of this new form of Gulf diplomacy when we look at what Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states did in 2011 in response to the uprising in Syria. Saudi Arabia took the initiative on August 8th in that year, 2011. King Abdullah issued the statement condemning the violence in Syria and recalling the Saudi ambassador from Damascus, though he had been on leave at the time, but it was still a formal recalling. Qatar used its role in charge of the rotating presidency of the Arab League to press for suspension of Syria's membership, and the League approved it on November 12th of that year. The Arab League also approved sanctions against the Syrian regime, which was rather unprecedented at the time, and those were passed on November 27th. Saudi Arabia then sought to translate this diplomatic success at the Arab League into concrete action at the United Nations, circulating a draft resolution in February of 2012. A resolution was eventually passed a few months later during the summer, not the exact same one that was intended back in February, and that became UN General Assembly Resolution 11266, and that was drafted by Saudi Arabia, strongly backed by Qatar. King Abdullah gave further weight to the resolution by holding an extraordinary summit of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation on August 14th of that year, in 2012, at which the group suspended Syria's membership from the OIC. And the final communique from that summit explicitly stressed the Syrian government's responsibility for the continued violence, for the destruction of property, and moreover, the summit communique also criticized the UN, Arab League envoy, for failing to achieve tangible results. It's a feedback loop, one multilateral organization criticizing another, but all through the lens of Saudi pressure and Saudi diplomacy. And the Saudis then used the optic, the visual image of 57 heads of state in the OIC, or the representatives, meeting in Mecca during the last days of Ramadan in that year, to critique the international community's approach to a regional crisis and to express their solidarity for a diplomatic solution, one that would be in line with the same diplomatic solution that Saudi Arabia had been promoting for over a year. What we see in all of this is Saudi Arabia setting the tone, often with a royal decree from King Abdullah or a public statement from King Abdullah himself. Then Saudi Arabia using the GCC to clarify and expand upon that proclamation, going to the Arab League or the OIC, and using that as a springboard to then get further action out of the United Nations and from the West. It's a multi-tiered diplomatic approach to using these multilateral fora to accomplish Saudi's diplomatic goals. That might seem all very ordinary for those of us engaged in diplomacy on a daily basis, but that's actually rather unusual for Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states historically. It's hard to find other examples of it. And in fact, most experts over the last 3 years have commented on how the GCC states have responded to the regional unrest. They comment in terms of financial dispensations, conservative reactions, paying off publics to maintain stability and quiet at home. But what most experts don't notice is the aspect of diplomacy, which is often what we talk about first when we talk about other countries in the region. And it's important to notice how assertive and aggressive this new approach to diplomacy is, not just in Riyadh, but also in Abu Dhabi and in Doha. To understand how different it is, look at the 2006 Lebanon War. At that time, the Saudi government issued a press statement. The press statement drew a fine line between its support for legitimate resistance and what it deemed to be rash adventures carried out, quote, without consultation or coordination with Arab countries. Sort of a bifurcated statement and not much follow-up. When we look at the 2009 Gaza war, January of that year, Saudi Arabia and Qatar were very involved in what was going on, but I think that the conclusions we draw from that lesson is that Saudi diplomacy was a delayed reaction to rival diplomatic maneuvers in the region, i.e. Qatar's holding of an emergency summit inviting Iran. Saudi then held a rival summit, in essence in Kuwait, which became the Arab Reconciliation Summit. 2, Riyadh's planning was done in consultation, heavy consultation with its international partners, not just within the GCC, but with every stakeholder that needed to be consulted with more broadly. 3, Riyadh back then in 2009, it was more focused on defending its leadership of the Arab world, leaving Egypt and the Arab League to deal with the details of the crisis and following up with the international community response. Number 4, what we see in 2009 is the end results of that diplomacy didn't require any follow-up from Saudi Arabia, and it didn't require any long-term commitment from Saudi Arabia beyond the humanitarian donations that were granted. This is very different from the diplomatic approach we see in the last 3 years. In fact, what you saw in 2009 is much more typical of previous experience in 2006, much more typical of Saudi Arabia's predilection for dealing with these multilateral fora. Certainly before the Arab Spring, we never saw such things as using the GCC Secretariat to promote the transition of power in Yemen that we saw in 2011, or Saudi Arabia rejecting the UN Security Council seat in 2013. this focus on multilateral and international diplomacy and doing it according to Saudi's agenda, the way Saudi prioritizes its agenda in the world, similarly with Abu Dhabi in coordination. And we could say similar things about Doha. The Arab Gulf states historically preferred to act in concert with like-minded Arab allies, leaving the regional Arab partners to take the public lead in diplomatic negotiations. And they chose to voice their support for policy through significant donations to humanitarian and development funds, only occasionally allowing their foreign ministers to release comments in the media in support of this or that cause. That desire for quiet consultation, consensus building, and checkbook diplomacy continues today. It hasn't stopped. But it's now being supplemented with a more direct role for the GCC states in shaping and guiding multilateral diplomatic efforts. I would expect that to occur with the current crises as well. My views and opinions here are entirely my own. They don't necessarily represent the State Department or the U.S. government, but I would imagine that moving forward, we're going to see a much more aggressive and assertive approach from the Gulf states, done primarily in consultation with each other over how to define and how to respond to these issues, and that's going to be a challenge for the West moving forward. Thank you.
I commend all the speakers for keeping within their allotted time constraints. And as we often like to say, in terms of these gatherings, we regard them as a cerebral massage. So with the settings, the backgrounds, the insights, the perspectives, the context that they have set before you, we'll now turn to the question and answer period. What I'll do here is ask, as they've been submitted to me, about 4 questions so that the adrenaline can begin to pump among the speakers here, and they can begin to formulate their succinct replies. And I will designate perhaps 1 or 2 people to be the responders, but others can chip in or disagree or ask their own questions as necessary. Several of these have to do with Iraq, and so I'll ask if Ambassador Sumaida'ie would be the first to respond to them, but invite also Tom Mattair's and David Roches' commentary as well. And these are not in order of priority as such. How, if at all, is the United States helping in implementing and maintaining and facilitating the education system in Iraq? How is business development being enriched throughout Iraq? If Iraqis cannot reconcile sufficiently to form an inclusive national government, what will Iraq look like? And what will its influence be? Are we talking about unity, confederation, separate countries? Yet another, how can ISIS or ISIL be controlled and reconciled, if at all, into Iraq's political order? Or is it a non-issue? Mr. Ambassador, would you like to have first response on those? And there is a
we speak from here.
Microphone. Yes.
Thank you. I take it from in reverse order. The last question is how to get ISIS to be integrated into the into any Iraqi political system. The simple answer is that it cannot. ISIS, by nature, by definition, by ideology, is an exclusionary form of movement. It's so puritanical that it considers anyone outside a very narrow band defined by its ideology to be a heretic and deserve death. Its activity in the field is so antipathic to the local population that it cannot really be assimilated or accepted. It causes revulsion, but it's a helpless kind of revulsion of the victim when that happens, like the way they treat women, the way they treat people in their daily behavior. So I don't see them being in any way integrating into society. And if they cannot integrate into society, they cannot integrate into a political system. That's how I see it. They create a lot of damage, but until they are removed, it's like saying, how can we integrate a vicious Ebola virus into the workings of a human body? It cannot. So that's that. And we'll go from that question to the questions at the other end of the spectrum, which is what is the United States doing to enhance education in Iraq? The sector of education, like all other sectors, have suffered greatly from the degradations of the past several decades, and to get it up and going and to improve it to a level that it was relative to other countries in half a century ago would take above all stability, security, and a concerted effort and the dedication of a lot of resources. Now, security is the first thing. We don't have security. You know, we have now so many displaced people in Iraq that it's a joke talking about enhancing the political system when a lot of our kids cannot go to school. Our universities, most of our university professors have been forced out of their universities into safe areas. So I think it's the wrong time for this question. The first thing that we should think about to get this sector repaired and improved is to repair the security and the political environment first. The business environment also is not going to thrive apart from those who thrive in war, and the people who sell arms, the people who sell security systems, the private security companies. They do a good business out there. But others are confronted with an environment which is hostile, an environment of corruption. Corruption is the enemy of business. You might get some deals going, but it's very rare that even those deals which are achieved end up in anything good. They don't end up in a profitable result for the companies, and they don't end up in a project being actually delivered to the end users. So all these basic issues have to be tackled to create the environment necessary for education, for business, for other things. The other question which I remember is, what kind of Iraq will there be if there is no consensus to produce an inclusive government? The first thing I'd like to say is that just to have the right numbers of ministers from this sect or that sect appointed does not necessarily mean this is an inclusive government. We had this kind of government under Malik. He had some Sunni ministers, some Kurdish ministers, but he undermined them by appointing all the director generals from his spectrum of politics. He appointed all the all the commanders of the army, all the commanders and the police from his from close associates, and the result is what we see. And those who needed the approval of Parliament, this very senior, it's like you have here, the Senate has to endorse appointments. In Iraq, we have a similar situation. What he did, then he appointed his cronies, but as acting commander or as an acting director general of this department or that. So effectively, a minister, when he is appointed as a political appointment, finds a ministry which has already been hijacked. He cannot run the ministry as if it is a really independent department serving the people. This is what has happened. So what we need is rethinking and reconstituting the government in a way that it actually delivers the services and the functions that it is supposed to be. But if we fail in doing that, and that's going to be a hard task for Mr. Al-Abadi, if he fails, I think we are facing a civil war that will continue further disintegration of Iraq as a country. Whether Iraq can be put together again in the future is an open question. I happen to believe that there is enough Iraqi nationalism, if you like, that can create a glue once the political problems are resolved. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'll ask Tom and Dave DeRoche to comment briefly, but mention a figure or two. Numbers are important. They often have implications for interest in policies. You mentioned the security-related foreign firms, American and others, and Iraq do it quite well. It's helpful to remember that during the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 88, there was a U.S.-Iraq business forum. There were some 50 American corporations that were very activist members of that group. Patrick Mancino and I met with the Iraq person at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce a couple of years ago and asked, what are the members now? And the answer was, we've not been able to get more than 15. And of those 15, 2 are counseling, so we're down to 13. And we're looking as though we'll be lucky if we have 9. So that's an extraordinary discrepancy. But capital is a coward. It does not want to go into places that are insecure, unstable, and uncertain. On the other figures, or related to that somewhat, Iraq's population, when the U.S. led the invasion and occupation, was reportedly 24 million. 2 million of the cream of the creme fled, the intellectuals, professional class, middle class, quite early on. And another 2 million were domestically displaced. Now that's 1/6 of the country's population. In American equivalency terms, that would be 50 million Americans, refugees or displaced as a result of a foreign-led invasion or occupation. And in terms of figures pertaining to Matt Reynolds, if it's true that the population of Gaza is estimated at 1.6 million, and a report in one of the newspapers several days ago that 200,000 of those have been displaced, that would be the equivalent of 48 million Americans having been displaced in the last month. It's hard to get one's mind wrapped around these kinds of realities, and at the same time one cannot ignore them, especially when the United States is seen by so many in the region as complicit, if not sustaining and maintaining, then supporting, with the U.S. being probably the only government that seems to be vocal in supporting the Israeli narrative, from the President, the Vice President, and most members of Congress, including all but 8 members of the House of Representatives accepting the Israeli narrative, when one cannot say, other than a country at the Eastern Mediterranean, any European country, any Asian country, any African country, any Latin American country, lobbied the United States to do that. Tom? Dick?
Okay, I would agree with my colleague, the ambassador, that ISIL cannot be integrated into the Iraqi government. Considering their ideology and their behavior, I can't imagine them sharing power or sharing vision with the others. As far as what happens if there's no reconciliation among the major factions in Iraq, then I think you have more of the same. You have more bloodletting in the streets and more lack of coordination between Baghdad and the Kurdish government about revenue sharing and oil exports, and more support in the west and the north for the Islamic State from the Sunni Arab community. So, and that can degenerate even further, so that you actually do have fragmentation of the state. It's a distinct possibility that could happen, and that Iraq would end up being three entities, I suppose. How to control the ISIL? Well, that would involve the new prime minister, who is from the same party as al-Maliki, but may not be as close to Iran as al-Maliki was, because he didn't live there or in Syria. It would involve him not just staffing the cabinet with more representative people, but also staffing his own office, the prime minister's office, and his own personal security forces, and all of that. And then, if you actually have more representative government, I think that this would be the time for Sunni Arab states to show up, particularly Saudi Arabia, to show up in Baghdad and begin to play a role and to compete for influence with Iran. And in that way, help a more inclusive government fight ISIL, especially because of all the intelligence assets that the Saudis have and some of their neighbors have. And then drain and then reach out to the tribes in western Iraq and seek their support, pull them away from the Islamic State. And of course, airstrikes. They seem to have been successful in pushing ISIL away from the dam in Mosul, and I wish I could espouse the John Lennon philosophy of the world, but I wouldn't know how to do that with groups like ISIL running around.
Okay. Councilor Roche.
Let me just pile on those previous 2 points. Preparing for this, I read both issues of Dabiq, the ISIL magazine. The name is significant. And they proudly have pictures of an adulteress being stoned. They have a whole photo spread on shrines being blown up in Mosul and Tel Afar. They have pictures of Syrian soldiers being executed. I do not see this organization making peace with people who they refer to as Rafidis or Safawis. Let me talk a little bit about classical counterinsurgency theory, which envisions an insurgency as a pyramid. The top of the pyramid are the most active members of the insurgency. These are the hardcore people who are fighting for a caliphate. And then as you go down towards the pyramid, the base widens in numbers of population, but they become less active in their support. And pretty much what you have to do is take the tip of the pyramid out of the population some way. You either kill them or deport them or put a great distance from them. And then you have to shrink the base by providing an alternative to them. And at the end of the day, that's what's going to happen. Right now, for most Sunni who have been living under the Iraqi government for the last few years, they do not see a credible alternative, or at least they did not see a credible alternative. The alternative may start to appear more credible, more enviable once they've lived under this Islamic regime for a while. But there has to be an alternative. If you shrink that pyramid, kill the base, you'll be fine. And the final point I'd like to make, this is a technical one, but the efficacy of airstrikes is going to decrease at a very, very rapid rate. At a very, very rapid rate. They will adjust very quickly. And the constraints that we have to operate under, to fly from a carrier in the Persian Gulf, go all the way out there, you don't have much loiter time, and then go all the way back. And imagine what happens when one of those planes gets shot down. Recall what happened when Ron Settle was shot down over Lebanon in 1983. That pretty much put an end to airstrikes over Lebanon, and then we were firing shells off the USS New Jersey of the Lebanese forces in Souk al-Harb. Didn't work out so well.
We have the duty to acknowledge the presence of the ambassador of the League of Arab States with us, former ambassador of Qatar, and quite a few diplomats from countries pertaining to the topics, including from Iran as well here today. Back on the Palestinian issue, the ambassador's last remarks added that one cannot be unmindful that along with this single greatest obstacle to American, Arab, American Islamic good relations, the oldest one, the most pervasive one, that this will itself be the root cause for additional numbers of violent extremists. And related to that, and I see Matthew, if you take a first cut at it, perhaps Imad, you. Why would we expect Hamas to stop resistance and violence when we declare them terrorists and refuse to recognize them or negotiate with them? And partially stated a different way, is it not the essence of strategic wisdom that one negotiates with one's adversaries and enemies, not one's friends? And were America to have a comparable position, we would still be in Vietnam. The government of South Vietnam never once recognized the right of the Viet Cong in North Vietnam to exist. We never forced the Viet Cong or North Vietnam to recognize the right of the Republic of Vietnam to exist. Had we insisted on that, there'd be more than 50,000 names on the walls of the Americans killed there, and untold millions more of Vietnamese. Had the French government demanded that the Algerian rebels demand France's right to retain its sovereignty over Algeria, that would be more than the 8.5 Algerians who was an orphan at independence. So these are implications. As I said, we cannot blame others for these policies. And it's one thing to shoot oneself in the foot, but it beggars the question, why reload faster than anybody else? Matt?
Yeah, thank you. I'm actually going to have, Imad can take on most of the political answers because as UNRWA we really don't get involved in the political discussions. More of attention. I would say though that there is an attempt by the Palestinians through a unity cabinet, which all the parties have supported, that presents itself as a Palestine cabinet that represents all of the parties. So there is a partner that's available. But I think I'll defer to my colleague to get into more of the political details.
Thank you. I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that Hamas is just simply, being used as basically a prop to say no to resolve the Palestinian issue. As far as I'm concerned, and as far as I know, and as far as I think all of you know, Hamas is no longer dreams of getting Palestine from the sea to the river, historical Palestine. I think this issue is going to be resolved way down the line when both peoples decide that this land is a one-state solution. I think Israel is using Hamas just simply to say, no, I don't want to give the Palestinians their rights as far as I'm concerned. Hamas has entered into an agreement with the Palestinian Authority on basically sharing power. They also agreed that a new government would be a technocratic government, so there won't be a specific Hamas presence into it. I don't know. I mean, remember, before 1993. The PLO was asked to recognize Israel, and once the PLO recognizes Israel, there goes peace. We're going to have peace immediately. I mean, it's to me, it's a play on semantics. It's like we're trying to find a way of not reaching a solution. Whether it's Hamas, whether it is Islamic Jihad. I mean, if Hamas were to turn tomorrow and say, well, we announced that we accept Israel and its borders, 67 nevertheless. Israel would say, well, still the Islamic Jihad organization has not accepted us yet. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't think that the issue is with Hamas. I think the issue is on the other side of the border.
There was earlier a comment about an aspect of the ISIS adherents and supporters and fighters being Wahhabis. And one can infer what one wants from such an implication. But might it be fair that many would say, well, you're talking about Saudi Arabia. And if so, then one needs to address that. And the context being that there are others from the same Islamic school of law, which is the Hanbali school of law. Qatar subscribes to the same school of law, and so do 4 out of the 7 United Arab Emirates. So, Mr. Ambassador, you were the one, I think, you made that comment. Would you like to elaborate on that? And perhaps Tom or Dave or anybody else come in? Josh, feel free to.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I don't want to turn this discussion into a theological discussion, but I just want to illustrate the mindset that underpins the mentality of the jihadists in ISIS, in ISIS. Yes, Hanbali is the puritanical branch. We have 4 major jurisprudence schools. The most flexible and permissive is the Hanafi. The least flexible is the Hanbali. Hanbalis are the puritanical side of Islam. But within Hanbali, there were people who are extremely Hanbali, if you like, and the Wahhabis who were born as a school of thought in the very harsh environment of Najd, in the center of the Arabian Peninsula, where life was really hard and social norms extremely strict. And their interpretations of some of the early edicts and the texts were so strict that they simply cannot be taken and applied in a city like Cairo, which had an opera house in the 19th century, or Baghdad, which has always had places where people drink wine or local liquor and have music. They are entirely different social environments. Yet, these people who are raised in schools and taught this brand of Islam, and I'm not now referring to specific states, but these schools indoctrinate children to such an extent that they grow up believing that that is Islam, anything else is heresy. They become, and if they become depressed or alienated or upset about something, they go more to the extreme. So out of a spectrum of 1,000 children, you get about 5 maybe who are willing to go right to the extreme. Extremism is a phenomenon. You've got the bell shape of phenomenon in any social situation, and the extreme will always be there. But when the base element, where the center of the curve is already extreme relative to others, you can imagine what those, and that is ISIS. We are dealing with a phenomenon which is the extreme among the extremists. What I'm saying is that the ideology which is taught at schools and in mosques and madrasas across the Islamic world, funded from Gulf states, not necessarily by states, but very often by private interests and private individuals, create that kind of result. And this result is dangerous, and it has to be dealt with. I implemented a project in Pakistan in the 80s. Pakistan was practically always very far. Well, most of them are to my knowledge, closer to the Sufi Islam, and certainly Hanafi. In the project, we designed a calligraphy piece, 2 calligraphy pieces. One says, Ya Allah, means approaching God or invoking God. And the other side says, Ya Muhammad. There was a demonstration against this by a local madrasa, which was funded from sources in the Arabian Peninsula, telling them that they should not invoke Muhammad, they should only invoke Allah, and therefore this is heresy. And this was alien to Pakistan, but yet it was planted there. Now it is planted in Afghanistan, in Chechnya, in Indonesia, everywhere. And that is the root of the ideology which has produced ISIS. Unless we recognize it, and if it's not politically expedient to face this, that's a different matter. But that is a reality that what has to be confronted and dealt with. Thank you.
I'd like Tom, Imad's, and Joshua's input on this. And related to that is a question: how can the Gulf governments best prevent private or religious financial flows to ISIS? Tom or Joshua or Imad?
I don't disagree with anything that was said. I just want to balance that by noting that you have a number of institutions in Saudi Arabia involved in religious outreach and religious education that are a core part of Saudi society. Institutions that have been around for quite a long time, employing many individuals and families within Saudi Arabia that owe their reputations or livelihoods to those institutions. More than that, you have a government in Riyadh that has engaged in several initiatives and several programs to counter radical Islamist thought and to counter terrorist ideologies. So we do have to understand there's more of a nuance in a lot of these issues. I don't want to be a defender of any one particular side here, but I do want to at least present both aspects of this. And more than that, you have debates within Salafi thought that exist both inside the kingdom and in other countries in the region. You have debates within Salafi circles in North Africa and in Egypt, among Salafists there. At the same time, there's not always oversight. This holds true for a number of governments in the region. There's not always complete oversight of all of the programs and initiatives going on abroad. And so that goes back to what I think Imad was saying. But I think the most interesting development we've seen this year in all of these aspects are the foundation of a new Association of Islamic Authorities sponsored by the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, in contrast to the Islamic Union, the Union of Islamic and Muslim Scholars based in Doha. And you see a lot of outreach to Al-Azhar in Cairo. Just today, Al-Azhar announced that they would give an honorary doctorate to King Abdullah for all of his efforts on behalf of the Muslim world. And you see this partnership with Al-Azhar in order to try and find a more moderate approach in the region and to support it and to give it the resources it needs to try and challenge some of the more radical ideologies. And I think we'll see a lot more moving forward of that support for Al-Azhar, trying to boost its weight and its influence in the region.
Thank you. And apropos that, when Matthew Reynolds was the Assistant Secretary of State for Congressional Affairs under Condoleezza Rice, both at her tenure and Colin Powell's before, there were repeated statements that no country was cooperating more with the United States, shoulder to shoulder, to counter these phenomena, forces and factors, and to staunch the financial flows. And in the last 10 days, it appeared only on page 10 of the New York Times, Saudi Arabia contributed $500 billion to a United Nations fund to focus exclusively on counterterrorism there. But Imad, in asking you to be the first one to add to this.
Well, can I make a remark about this issue?
All right.
Saudi society is more conservative than the Saudi royal family. So the king is reforming at a pace that is measured and designed not to elicit a conservative backlash. But he has removed radical clerics and reformed the educational system. And they have tighter financial regulations than other neighbors, so their efforts to control individual financing of radical organizations is a little tighter. And as a matter of fact, when the UN Security Council just named some of the financiers of ISIL and banned them, they were not from Saudi Arabia. I think they've had a wake-up call in the mid-2000s when Al-Qaeda undertook actions inside the kingdom, and so their Ministry of Interior is energetically trying to identify and deal with those people. And they probably have the networks in the tribes and to identify people outside of the country and help Iraq.
Thank you, Tom. Imad will come to you in a minute, and Ambassador also to make another brief point. The question is, did the United States miss the boat by not giving more military support to Syria's rebels in past years? Apropos this, the same kind of question was posed when the United States had a dilemma on the nature, the degree, and the extent to which it would support the rebels in Syria seeking to overthrow the government of Muammar Gaddafi. And people called for air support or an air corridor. But then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, said, if you go into another country to do that, you have to take out its air defense system. The implications of that are enormous in terms of warlike activities. Now, the same would apply in Syria, but arguably more so, because Syria's air defense system is overwhelmingly Russian from the Soviet era. And one can examine what the implications of that were the United States to take out a Russian-supported air defense system in Syria. Would Moscow hibernate or accommodate that? I think the answer is fraught with problems there. But Imad, you want to address that? And related to one, about the future of American academic institutions in Iraq. American University Beirut, of course, is more than a century old, and it's been a beacon, a flagship for American ideals and values and principles, beliefs, traditions, practices, and the like. And it's trained many an Arab leader and many a non-Arab leader. Zalmi Khalilzad was one of the scholarship recipients to American University Beirut as an Afghan. Okay, Imad, have a whack at this, and then let's invest it.
Okay, well, I think, yeah, we are related in Syria. Yes, there is definitely the problem of taking out the air defense system. Obviously there is, but there was a problem of taking out the Iraqi air defense system in 2003. Yes, I know that Russia was not opposed at the time and did not want to put up some resistance to this. But the issue is not necessarily to degrade the Syrian Air Force or anything like that. I mean, you know, when the Afghani war, I know we ended up with Al-Qaeda basically, but the idea is worth at least exploring. I mean, we have an environment that is really truly going to hell in a basket, so to speak. Jordan, I'm sure that there are trainings taking place in Jordan. I think that there are people, a lot of former Syrian army officers who are in the refugee camps around Syria who are basically unemployed. They would be a great asset to try to support some sort of a building of a third force. I mean, Kenneth Pollock, just a couple of months ago, I was listening to him, I think it was his Bureau Function, where he said, well, a third force is possible to be built, although before that he said, no, leave Syria alone, we don't want to interfere there, but he turned out to change his mind on it. You know, there was a third force that was established in after 2007 in Iraq called the Sahwa. Today, Noor al-Maliki, or actually last month, Noor al-Maliki was using them for his own political support, but those people were essential for basically ending the Al-Qaeda in Iraq threat. So, I mean, you know, if we don't do anything, nothing is going to change. Maybe if we do something, something will, as far as I'm concerned. Yes, the Libya issue was there. Yes, that's fine. But you know, America at the time chose to lead from behind. But then, without the prodding of the Gulf states, probably the United States was encouraged by the Gulf Arabs to take some sort of a stand, like it did. Because, you know, after all, Qatar and the UAE sent squadrons of airplanes to help with the NATO effort. But you know, maybe Libya was a clearer case than the Syria issue, because Libya was Muammar Gaddafi. Everybody hated him, so everybody would go against him. But I think something should be done in Syria. Yes, maybe not our F-16s, but maybe we can help train some sort of a moderate force that can do that.
Last comment from the ambassador, and then I'll make a closing remark.
Just a couple of comments briefly about Syria. In 2010, 2011, I made some statements here in Washington about the Syrian regime and the way that it's oppressing its people and creating problems in the region. That seemed to have upset my government in Baghdad. So I was admonished gently by the foreign minister overnight. And then I told them, look, last year, in 2010, your instructions were to try and get American support to help Iraq's case against Syria because they were involved, according to the Iraqi government, in the terrorist bombing of our foreign ministry. At that time, they bombed two ministries in Iraq, and in the foreign ministry alone, we lost about 25 young diplomats. And the instructions of the government then was Syria was behind it. Now how come in 1 year, now we cannot criticize Syria? Obviously for sectarian reasons. So I think it was, and then later in the civil war in Syria, there was definitely intervention, foreign military intervention in the form of Hezbollah and form of Iranian active support with the aiding and abetting of the Iraqi government, and that helped the Syrian regime to stick together. So there was nothing really equivalent to that on the other side. So that's what I have to say on Syria. Just a final, very, very brief comment on this business of the education of terrorists and primary education. Look, I know now if you go in any mosque in Saudi Arabia and try to collect donations for jihadis, you would be slapped very hard. And the Saudi government is conscious about looking right and looking good in the international context, not to allow financing and funding to ISIS. It's good to be seen to be promoting a seaweed, a weed killer. My point is to stop people sowing the seed for weeds. That is the point. That's where we should be concentrating, focusing attention. By the time you are dealing with ISIS, it's too late. The phenomenon is out of control. You should stop educating children in a way that allows them even to become anything close to the monsters that we see in ISIS. That is the point.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Lastly here, I'd like to remind everybody that even though the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations is not a university, there's not a day that passes without being involved with educational issues and with the propagation and elucidation of ideas and information and insight and ideals and interests and involvement. All 6 of those words begin with an I, so I guess the I's have it there. But at the same time, we're not a governmental organization. We're proudly a non-governmental organization. And yet not a day passes without being concerned with and trying our best to make a contribution to what would otherwise pass for a national conversation or dialogue about America's legitimate needs, America's legitimate interests, America's legitimate concerns, America's legitimate aspirations, America's legitimate foreign policy objectives nationally, but also internationally. In the process, we are humble enough to acknowledge we have no monopoly on the method. We have no trademark on the technique. We have no copyright on the concept. And we have no patent on the process. We thank all of you for being here and contributing to these great questions. Several that did not get to be answered. But I think perhaps if the speakers would remain behind for a few minutes, those who asked them or want to know the answers might come forward. And one is, how will Iraq's and Syria's minorities survive this conflict? Turkomans, Christians, Yazidis, etc. Will these groups simply disappear from Iraq, if not also Syria? And another related one that's problematic, with reports that many ISIS soldiers or former Ba'athist military. How have these individuals managed to shift their ideological terrain so drastically? Please join me in thanking all of our specialists.